3 disturbing true roommate horror stories. Story number 1, The Locked Room. When I first moved to the city for my dream job, I was thrilled to find an affordable room for rent in a beautiful Victorian house. The owner, Dr. Marcus Elliott, was a distinguished-looking man in his 50s with salt and pepper hair and wire-rimmed glasses. He seemed kind and professional, explaining that he rented out rooms to help cover the costs of maintaining the historic property. "There's just one rule," Dr. Elliott said as he showed me around. "The east wing of the house is strictly off-limits. It's where I conduct my research, and it's full of sensitive equipment. The door is always locked, so you needn't worry about accidentally wandering in." I agreed without hesitation. The room was spacious, the rent was reasonable, and the location was perfect. What did I care about some locked rooms in another part of the house? For the first few weeks, everything was perfect. Dr. Elliott was rarely home, and when he was quiet and kept to himself. I settled into a routine, enjoying my new job and exploring the city on weekends. But then the noises started. It began with faint scratching sounds coming from the walls late at night. At first, I dismissed it as mice or the house settling. But as the days went by, the noises grew louder and more frequent. Sometimes I'd hear muffled thumps, like something heavy being dragged across the floor. Other times I could have sworn I heard whimpering or crying. One night, unable to sleep due to the unsettling sounds, I decided to investigate. I crept down the hallway towards the east wing, my heart pounding. As I approached the locked door, the noises grew louder. I pressed my ear against the wood, straining to hear. Suddenly, a blood-curdling scream erupted from the other side of the door. I jumped back, my own scream caught in my throat. The doorknob rattled violently as if someone was trying to get out. "Help me!" a woman's voice cried. "Please, someone help." Before I could react, a hand clamped down on my shoulder. I whirled around to find Dr. Elliott standing behind me, his eyes cold and furious. "I thought I made the rules clear," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "This area is off-limits. But there's someone in there," I stammered. "They need help." Dr. Elliott's expression softened into a sad smile. "Ah, I see. You've heard my wife. I'm afraid she's very ill, early-onset dementia. She has episodes where she becomes confused and frightened. That's why I keep her in a secure wing of the house for her own safety. I'm sorry you had to hear that." His explanation made sense, but something still felt off. Why hadn't he mentioned his wife before? And why did he look so angry when he first found me? "I think it's best if you return to your room now," Dr. Elliott said firmly. "Try to get some sleep. I'll make sure Caroline takes her medication so she doesn't disturb you again." I nodded and retreated to my room, but sleep eluded me. The next day, I decided to do some research on Dr. Elliott. What I found chilled me to the bone. Dr. Marcus Elliott had indeed been married 5 times, and all 5 of his wives had mysteriously disappeared over the past 20 years. The police had investigated, but no bodies were ever found, and there wasn't enough evidence to charge him with anything. Horrified, I realized I needed to get out of that house immediately. But as I was packing my bags, I heard a commotion downstairs. Police officers were swarming the house, and Dr. Elliott was being led away in handcuffs. It turned out that one of his previous tenants had gone to the police with suspicions similar to mine. This time they had enough probable cause for a search warrant. In the locked East Wing, they found 3 women, including the real Caroline Elliott, who had been missing for years. Dr. Elliott had been keeping them prisoner, subjecting them to twisted psychological experiments. As I gave my statement to the police, I couldn't stop shaking. I'd been living just down the hall from those poor women for weeks, oblivious to their suffering. The scratching I'd heard had been their attempts to signal for help. I moved out that same day, unable to stay in that house of horrors for another moment. For months afterward, I had nightmares about locked doors and muffled screams. I became hyper-vigilant about my living situations, always researching potential landlords and roommates extensively. The experience taught me a valuable lesson. Sometimes the monsters hiding in plain sight are far more terrifying than any ghost or bogeyman. And when your instincts tell you something isn't right, listen to them. They just might save your life. Story number 2, The Doppelganger. When my best friend Lisa suggested I rent the spare room in her apartment after my bad breakup, it seemed like the perfect solution. The rent was affordable, the location was great, and I'd be living with someone I trusted completely. What could go wrong? For the first few months, everything was great. Lisa and I fell into an easy rhythm of coexistence, sharing meals, watching movies, and supporting each other through the ups and downs of our lives. I started to feel like myself again, the pain of my breakup fading into the background. But then Lisa started acting strange. It began with small things. She'd wear clothes that looked suspiciously like mine, or style her hair in the same way I did. At first I found it flattering. Imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, right? But as time went on, the mimicry became more pronounced and unsettling. Lisa started using the same phrases I did, adopting my mannerisms, even changing her makeup to match mine. When I got a new haircut, she showed up the next day with an identical style. It was as if she was trying to become my clone. I tried to brush it off as a weird phase, but things only escalated. One day I came home to find Lisa talking on the phone, using my name and pretending to be me. When I confronted her about it, she laughed it off, claiming it was just a prank on a telemarketer. But the incident left me shaken. I started paying closer attention to Lisa's behavior, and what I noticed terrified me. She was systematically copying every aspect of my life. My clothes, my hobbies, my mannerisms, even the way I spoke. It was like living with a funhouse mirror version of myself. The final straw came when I discovered Lisa had been going through my personal belongings while I was at work. She had copied my resume and was applying for jobs at my company using my credentials. When I found a folder on her laptop filled with photos of me, many taken without my knowledge, I knew I had to get out. I confronted Lisa, demanding an explanation for her bizarre behavior. Her response chilled me to the core. "Don't you see?" she said, her eyes wide and intense. "I'm becoming you, a better you. The you were always meant to be. Soon I'll take over your life completely and no one will even notice the difference." Terrified, I fled the apartment that night, crashing on another friend's couch while I figured out my next move. I reported Lisa's behavior to the police, but without concrete evidence of a crime, there wasn't much they could do. In the days that followed, I discovered the horrifying extent of Lisa's obsession. She had been slowly taking over my social media accounts, messaging my friends and family while pretending to be me. She had even started dating my ex-boyfriend, slipping into my life like a cuckoo in another bird's nest. It took months of legal battles and therapy to reclaim my identity and my life. I had to change my phone number, email addresses, and even my name to escape Lisa's relentless attempts to become me. The experience left me with a deep-seated fear of close friendships and a paranoid attention to the small details that make up a person's identity. Years later, I still sometimes catch myself looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see my own face staring back at me. The idea that someone could want so desperately to become another person, to erase their own identity and replace it with someone else's, haunts me to this day. If there's one thing I learned from my experience with Lisa, it's that the people we think we know the best can sometimes be hiding the darkest secrets. And that the scariest monsters aren't always strangers. Sometimes they're the friends we invite into our homes and our lives. Story number 3, the hidden tenant. When I landed my dream job in New York City, I knew finding an affordable apartment would be a challenge. So when I came across a listing for a beautiful brownstone with reasonable rent, I jumped at the chance. The landlady, Mrs. Pemberton, was a sweet elderly woman who lived on the first floor. She explained that the previous tenant had left suddenly, leaving most of the furniture behind, which I could use. "It's such a large space for one person," Mrs. Pemberton said as she showed me around the spacious second-floor apartment. "But I'm sure you'll find it comfortable. Just remember, dear, the attic is off-limits. It's not safe up there, and I use it for storage." I agreed readily, thrilled to have found such a gem in the cutthroat New York real estate market. I moved in the following week, excited to start my new life in the city. At first, everything was perfect. The apartment was charming. My new job was challenging but rewarding, and I was slowly making friends in the city. But as the weeks went by, I started to notice odd things happening in the apartment. Food would disappear from my refrigerator overnight. Objects would be moved slightly from where I'd left them. Sometimes I'd wake up in the middle of the night sure I'd heard footsteps or muffled voices. I tried to rationalize these occurrences. Maybe I was more forgetful than I realized, or perhaps the stress of my new job was making me paranoid. But the feeling that something wasn't right persisted. One night I woke up to the sound of creaking floorboards. Holding my breath, I listened intently. The sounds were coming from above me, from the attic. Heart pounding, I crept out of bed and into the hallway. The attic door, which was always locked, stood slightly ajar. Gathering my courage, I climbed the narrow stairs. The attic was dark and musty, filled with old furniture and boxes. As my eyes adjusted to the gloom, I noticed something strange. A section of the attic had been cleared out and turned into a small living space. There was a mattress on the floor, surrounded by food wrappers and dirty clothes. Suddenly, I heard a noise behind me. I whirled around to find a disheveled man standing at the top of the stairs, his eyes wide with surprise and fear.
Who are you?
I gasped. What are you doing here? The man held up his hands placatingly. Please, don't scream. I'm not going to hurt you. My name is David. I used to live here. Over the next hour, David told me his story. He had been the previous tenant, but when he lost his job and couldn't afford the rent, Mrs. Pemberton had made him a twisted offer. He could continue living in the attic rent-free if he played along with her scheme to rent out the main apartment. She said it was the only way she could afford to keep the house, David explained. I knew it was wrong, but I was desperate. I'm so sorry for scaring you. Horrified and conflicted, I didn't know what to do. Part of me sympathized with David's plight, but another part was terrified at the thought of a stranger living secretly in my home. In the end, I decided to go to the police. They investigated and found that Mrs. Pemberton had been running this scam for years, trapping vulnerable tenants in the attic while renting out the main living space for profit. David and several others were provided with housing assistance and mental health support. As for me, I broke my lease and moved out immediately, unable to stay in a place with such dark secrets. The experience left me with a deep distrust of landlords and a paranoid habit of checking every nook and cranny of a new living space. Years later, I still sometimes wake up in the night convinced I hear footsteps in the attic. The idea that someone could be living secretly in my home, watching my every move, continues to haunt me. It's a chilling reminder that sometimes the greatest dangers are the ones we invite into our homes without even realizing it.